Well, that's enough of that. Hello, everyone. If you're there, does anybody? I can see a couple of you. Have you got video? Can we say hello? And can you hear me? Do please let me know if you can hear me. If there's a problem with the sound, that would be a real shame. So send me a message or turn your video on. And thanks, Chris. Brilliant. That's terrific. Thank you. Okay. Or turn your video on if you feel like it. So I had a very short, normally I play a slightly longer intro, but we've got a lot to get through today. So I did a shorter intro than usual. So I've got a few people on Restream, I can see, and I've got other people on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and X, or formerly Twitter. I think I'm always going to call it Twitter. But let's get started. Where are we? Let's do, whoops, I need to share a screen. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And we will start the presentation. So let me just, yeah, we're still here. Okay, so hello everyone, and wherever you are, in fact, do please let me know where you are, because for future reference, if this is an awkward time of the day for you, I can shift when these things are. So do please let me know what time zone you're in for future reference, and we'll make it at a better time if we can. Today's webinar is about risk matrices, and as it says, we're going to be answering some basic questions, some very popular questions. We're going to have a Q&A session, and I'm going to talk about some problem solvings, common problems with risk matrices and how to fix them. And indeed, we can talk about anything you want. So a quick word about me without going into a lot of detail. I've been doing this stuff for a long time, about 25 years on and off system safety engineering. And I've done all sorts of stuff in multiple countries. So the British way of doing things, as you may be able to tell from my accent, the US way of doing things, the Australian way of doing things, the European way of doing things. So lots and lots of different programs, ships and aircraft and all sorts of stuff. Okay, so I've done a lot of different things, which means that I'm not hung up on one particular solution. You'll meet some people who've only worked in one domain, and they'll insist that something is called this and nothing else. Well, that's not a lot of use to you if you work in a different domain, but I've worked in a few. So hopefully I'm not too hung up on one way of doing things, which I hope you will find helpful. So topics for this webinar, as I said, first of all, the most popular questions about risk matrices. And I've got some of the typical answers off the web, most of which are good, some of which are not. We can have a Q&A session, and then we'll have a chat about some common problems with matrices and how to fix them. And I'll be using the MIL standard 882E matrix as an example, okay? All matrices potentially suffer from these problems. 882 has been around a long time and is therefore a little bit creaky in certain areas, but I wouldn't single out that one in particular. Okay, a quick word about words for clarity. When I'm talking about hazards and risks, okay, and all that stuff, this is what I'm talking about. So I'm thinking about an accident sequence or a mishap sequence. 882E talks about mishaps. So not just accidental bad things happening, but maybe deliberate as well. And we have a progression from potentially multiple causes to one hazard to multiple consequences, okay? And the hazard is both necessary and sufficient for the accident, okay? So for example, an example of a hazard would be a surface that's hot enough to burn a human on touch in an area where humans are. Okay, so nothing unusual needs to happen for there to be an accident. All that needs to happen is for a human to touch that hot surface and they'll get burnt. Okay, so that's the accident. Okay, so that's the definition of hazard that I'm using. It's enough to cause an accident, but without the hazard, there is no accident. There can be no harm. Okay, and when we're talking about consequences, we're not just talking about accidents, about actual harm. We're talking about incidents, potential harm, or people being exposed to potential harm, to risk, or other events that have got no harm at all. So you can imagine on that consequences side, there's a range, there's a spectrum of outcomes of consequences ranging from really, really nasty harm to nothing at all. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about. So that's the picture, the model, if you like, that I'm thinking of when I'm talking about risk and accidents and stuff. And of course, the risk is the combination of the harm, the severity of the harm, and its probability. Okay, so we can't measure risk until we start thinking about consequences. Do bear that in mind. Oops. Okay, so part one, some risk matrix popular questions. And as I say, I've got some of this stuff from the infallible interweb. Infallible it is not, as we will see. So, very common question, what is a risk matrix? Well, here's an example. So we've got, very briefly, because I suspect most, if not all of you, are very familiar with risk matrices. It's just it's a two-dimensional chart or graph, if you like, with likelihood or probability on one axis and consequence or severity on the other. Okay, and in this example, which is just lifted off the web, from the colors that you may see, top right hand corner, we've got red indicating bad or danger. So clearly E in this case is most likely, and 6 is the worst or the highest consequence. Okay, and 1 is the lowest consequence and A is the lowest likelihood. Okay, in this example. So as it says, we've got a risk matrix, two intersecting factors, likelihood and impact or severity. And as it says, it's a tool that helps you visualize probability versus severity of a risk. Okay, we can do other things as well with it. And risk matrices have copped a lot of flack lately. I've seen on LinkedIn a lot of people blaming the tool. Okay, it's a bit silly to blame the tool. The tool is only what we make it. Okay, the matrix represents a certain number of decisions, as we will see. So how does it work? So as I've said already, a matrix is the sum of a lot of decisions, and it brings together some different definitions. So, different matrices will have different definitions of likelihood and consequence. And they will be, some matrices are purely qualitative, some are quantitative, they put numbers on there. Most in safety, most consequence ratings, most severities, most matrices seem to measure severity in harm. Okay, bad things happening, harm to people, or damage to equipment, damage to the environment, whatever it may be. There are some matrices that don't use harm as consequence. They might use loss of control or an erosion of safety margins, that kind of stuff. Okay, and you see that particularly in the air world, because losing control of your aircraft is almost always a very bad thing. Okay, but generally most matrices measure severity in terms of bad stuff, bad outcomes. Okay, and so on this matrix we have severity, and likelihood. We have a risk rating. As you can see, we've got ratings of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And also implicit in the colors, and different matrices do this differently, we've got some measure of risk acceptability. So those ratings or rankings, in this case, the risk rating and the risk acceptability seem to be the same thing. And matrices may do that acceptability consistently or inconsistently. Let me explain what I mean. If we look in the top right-hand corner there, we will see, there's my mouse there, you'll see this straight line. So we have a line of constant risk here, the boundary between the sector 1 and sector 2, between the red and the orange. And so if we imagine, let's say that column 4 is 1 death and column 5 is 10 deaths, up to 10 deaths, and column 6 is up to 100 deaths, or it might be injuries, okay, but it's 1, 10, 100. And if the likelihood is done in decades, so B is 10 times more likely than A, and C is 10 times more likely again, and so on. So the likelihood, if the likelihood is going up in decades, and so is the consequence, then we have a line of constant risk, okay? Now that's potentially important, because if we're saying it's unacceptable to have, let's say E is frequent risk of 1 death, but 10 times less likely for 10 deaths, or 100 times less likely for 100 deaths, that's a line of constant risk. So basically the risk per person is the same no matter where we are on that line, okay? So that makes logical sense, doesn't it? A certain risk of death per person in a certain time frame, let's say per person per year, is the limit of what we will accept, or maybe what the law allows, and that is a constant, okay? So that straight line makes some kind of sense from a per person per annum risk basis, okay? The other lines, which are a bit wiggly, and apologies for my drawing, but they're not straight lines. So we've got here, so assuming if we've got this sort of we go down or we go up 10 by 10 every time we move up or to the right, we have not got lines of constant risk there. So why is it that those kind of risks are rated differently? We haven't got lines of constant risk. Why are some severities or some more acceptable per person than others? Don't know. Now, as we will see, that may be a perfectly valid thing to do, but we would need to justify it, and we need to understand what we're doing. So the risk with some of these matrices that we get off the shelf and just use them is that there are assumptions and decisions implicit in them that we may not realize, okay? But rather than blame the matrix, it's up to us to use the tool responsibly and with understanding. So let's move on. Another common question, can they be qualitative or quantitative? Well, both. So here's a couple of tables from the Mill Standard 882E as it happens, and that uses, you can have both. So the left-hand probability levels, the left-hand table, we've got a qualitative expression of risk varying from likely to several times in the life of an item, right through to cannot possibly occur, okay, for an individual item, and then you can scale it up for a fleet of items. So let's imagine that you've got 365 items in your fleet. So if one item is going to experience something once a year, and you're using this thing every day of the year, then you're quite likely to have a hazard occur or a risk occur, an adverse event every day of the year, okay, if you scale it up for your fleet. And again, you've got to understand how big your fleet is and what's the operating profile, okay? Because, if you're only operating your fleet on weekdays, Monday through Friday, that's only without holidays, that's only sort of 220 to 240 days a year, as opposed to 365. So we've got to understand, the assumptions behind our definitions. What's the fleet size and operating profile. And also in 882E, we've got the very same frequent down to eliminated. We've got that in numbers. So we've got, let's say, 1 in 10 for A, down to between 1 in 10 and 1 in 100 for B, for probable, and so on. And it goes down 10 every time. Okay. So when I was talking about per decade, that's what I was talking about. So that's an example. That's pretty typical of a lot of risk matrices. Okay. So we can do one or the other, or both if we want to. So another common question: when is a risk matrix used? Now, interestingly, the project management view is that we use a risk matrix or risk control matrix at the planning stage. Okay, and that's it. Now, that's not the case for safety. Okay, because we're not doing project management. We're not looking at risks to a finite ended project, and we burn down those risks as we progress through the project. In safety, our risks are going to be there through the life cycle of the product or service or whatever it is. So we use the risk matrix at all points in the system life cycle, potentially. Okay, so good point to note the differences. The way we do risk in safety is not the way project managers do it. Nothing wrong with what they do, it's just different. Now, why use a risk matrix? I'm not, as you can tell from the illustration, I'm not particularly impressed with this answer. So here we've got saying, a risk matrix allows you to identify types of risk. No, it doesn't. You have to identify your risks and your hazards beforehand, and then you analyze them, and then you decide where they belong in the matrix. Okay, probability and severity, yes. Although it doesn't identify those things, it just gives you a framework to put them in. You've got to do that work. And then it says maintain a real-time view of the evolving risk environment. Well, again, that's nonsense. If you want a real-time view, a risk matrix is static. So unless you begin to, show your audience, well, this was the risk profile on date X, and now on date Y it's this, and this is how it's changed. A risk matrix on its own is static. If you want to do something dynamic, you need to add something to it. Okay, and it doesn't maintain a view of the evolving risk environment. You've got to do that through monitoring, through incident monitoring, through audits, through talking to your workers, through inspecting your workplace, all the other good stuff that you should be doing in a safety management system. Okay, a matrix is just a static display. It doesn't do those things. So we need to be a little bit careful about some of the things that are said online. And bearing in mind, these answers come from the most popular pages on Google. So that's the top answer for that question. So you've got to be a little bit careful about what's out there. So where do we use a risk matrix? Well, there's several different answers there. Sometimes we are mandated to use a risk matrix. Sometimes our customer or a regulator will say, this is the matrix you will use. Off you go. Sometimes it's useful to use a risk matrix. Sometimes we need to do it for certain things, and we'll talk about that later. And then finally, of course, just if you want to, if you find it helpful to visualize risk, and I think a lot of people do, then do it. Okay, as long as you understand what your matrix is telling you and how it was set up, that's great. And we'll come on to some examples, in fact, right now. So what do or don't we need a risk matrix for? So there's quite a lot of no answers on here. So first of all, I live and work in Australia, and in Australia we've defined, so far as is reasonably practicable, in general, is defined in a purely qualitative way. Okay, the only time I'll come back to that. So you don't need a risk matrix to declare SFARP, okay? Because your actual level of residual risk in Australia is almost irrelevant, in fact, to SFARP. Now, the exception to that is if in Australia you're operating what's called a major hazard facility, or an MHF. Imagine a big chemical plant, something like that. If you've got an MHF, then you need to apply SFARP quantitatively with tolerability, okay? And then you need a matrix. Or do you? Well, in theory, you don't need to do a LARP with tolerability or SFARP with tolerability. You don't need a matrix. You just need that LARP triangle, which I've kind of superimposed on the matrix there. So in theory, you don't need a matrix. But in reality, if you set up your matrix to support tolerability properly, you might as well use the one thing. So it can be very useful to help you with that, to see where you are in absolute terms of risk, as well as to help you make that tolerability decision in order to support your LARP decision. So third thing, you need a portfolio. If you're displaying a portfolio of risks to people, or you're managing a portfolio of risks, then a matrix is very useful, and you need that. And then finally, if you're trying to track individual risks and how they're moving over time, well, no, what you actually need is a hazard tracking system. You can display, where the risk has moved on the matrix, maybe. It's not really what it's kind of designed for, but you can do that. And you can display, brackets of uncertainty on the matrix as well. But that's not something that's built into the matrix. You have to add that, okay? You have to understand what the uncertainty is in your estimates. So there are some examples of when you do and don't need a matrix. And by the way, if you're thinking of questions, do pop them in the chat while I'm talking, and then when we get to the Q&A, we'll do that, okay? But do think about your questions now, and do feel free to pop them in the chat. Now, which kind of matrix is a risk matrix? And I apologize, I couldn't do something on matrices without a quote from the matrix. So, is it a sense-making model, or is it a categorization model? Which is it? Or, how should we use it? I'll answer that in part 3. Okay. But one allows us to believe what we want to believe, and one actually shows us reality, however frightening that reality might be. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of part 1. I just wanted to say there's some safety artisan resources out there to help you. So there's the Safety Engineering Academy, which this webinar and all my other webinars go into the Academy, and then it's $45 a month to access that with you as a set. There's normally a 7-day free trial period, but I've got a month for free offer going on at the moment. You can go and look at the website. There's lots of blog articles there and other resources. You can subscribe for regular emails from me, which are free. And it's well worth doing, because my subscribers get the best discounts and the first offers on everything that I'm doing. I run regular discounts. I've got 60% off all courses at Thinkific until the 31st of December. So if you go to my Thinkific site, you will, in fact, I haven't got I'll have to add that. What I will do is I will add all of this to the chat, so you've got the links. And then finally, there's my YouTube channel with all my publicly available free videos on it. So there's lots of resources out there. Okay, so we come now to a bit of Q&A and discussion. And while, I'm just going to stop sharing a sec. And while you are, there we go, we're back. Okay, so while you are looking at that and coming up with some questions, I will be popping some resources into the chat for you. So I'll just pop these in here. So we've got those, and I will just pop the Thinkific link in as well. Which won't take me a sec. So do keep those questions coming. Right. So here we go. I'm just going to pop this is the link to Thinkific. And as I say, it's 60% off all courses until the end of the month. So do we have any questions? Something has gone wrong here with the chat. Let me just, right. Oh no, it's back. Thank goodness for that. Right, so the chat is back. All the links are in there. I've got some more links for you for the next session. Okay, I've not got any questions so far, so I'm going to move on. So I'm going to share my screen again. And now we will move on to part 3. So here are some risk matrix problems and how to solve them. And I'm using, as I said, the example of the MIL standard 882E risk matrix. And so here it is. So it's a typical risk matrix in that severity is defined in terms of deaths and injuries. And then we've got probability defined either qualitatively or quantitatively, as we saw before. And then we've got a rating that says we've got high, serious, medium, or low risk, or the risk has been completely eliminated. Okay. And that doesn't mean it's under a certain threshold of probability. It means it has been physically eliminated. Okay. So there's the 882 matrix in all its glory. Okay. As I say, this is the example I'm using. All risk matrices have potential issues and they can all be misused. Okay. So it's up to us to know how to use them properly. So the first problem that we can have with risk matrices is we can have meaningless definitions of severity. Okay, so in the 882, catastrophic is single death, critical as a single severe injury, and then marginal and negligible have their definitions. However, those definitions were invented in the USA, and they don't necessarily mean anything even in the USA, in different states. But certainly here in Australia, if you wanted to describe a serious injury, there is a term in law in WHS that says this is what a serious injury is, and then it defines examples of them. Okay, so if we wanted a more meaningful risk matrix for an Australian application, we should go to the law and use the definitions that are there. And then maybe for lesser injuries, there's a definition of what we call a lost time injury, or an injury that would mean that somebody had to go to hospital or an emergency department, something like that, something that couldn't be treated with first aid on site. Okay, so there are different definitions that make sense in Australia and probably where you are as well. And so the solution is identify meaningful severity levels for where you are, the legal jurisdiction and the industry, and redefine your matrix. Okay, easy. Now, the second issue is potentially unique to MIL Standard 882E because 882E talks about a hazard risk matrix, and it talks about HRIs or hazard risk indices or a hazard risk index, and it puts numbers on those individual boxes. And the problem with that is, first of all, it's not a hazard matrix because a hazard itself doesn't have severity. Okay, it's a risk matrix. Okay, not a hazard matrix. Okay, so we've got to have a level of severity of harm or whatever to define our risk. And for many types of accidents, and I've got an example here of fire, you can imagine a very small fire or even a large fire where nobody gets hurt. So the severity rating might be negligible. Or we might have a fire in which one or more people get killed. So it could be catastrophic. Okay. Now, so how do we express that if we're linking hazard and risk together in a one-to-one relationship? Well, we can't. Well, we can, but one bad way of doing it is that you end up with one hazard and one outcome. You say, I've got a fire that leads to one death, or a fire that leads to one severe injury, or a fire that leads to one negligible injury, or whatever it might be. And the danger then is you end up with lots of stovepipes or silos with individual hazards, which is false, because once a fire starts, you don't know where it's going to go, what's going to happen. And you can end up with an awful lot of multiple hazards covering the same thing, which has a number of bad consequences. It gets in the way of true understanding. You end up with hundreds of hazards in your hazard log, which then become unmanageable. And also, of course, you've got fragments of hazards, and you're rating the risk of each fragment, not the total risk of that accident, okay, or that, that of fire in this example. So we're not getting a good outcome there if we do that, okay? So what we need to do for each hazard is identify the range of consequences, the multiple consequences that are possible, and manage them suitably. Okay, so the risk matrix itself doesn't really help us to do that. We need to understand that right-hand side of the bow tie that I showed you at the beginning. Maybe use an event tree analysis or something to work that out. Okay, and then we can capture that risk maybe with different outcomes for the same hazard. Okay. Now another one, the 882 matrix, the worst accident it's got is single death. So it doesn't discriminate between an accident that kills one person or more than one person. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. If you're in a single seat aircraft or you're riding a bike, you're very likely to only kill one person. Okay. But for pretty much everything else, buildings, ships, other vehicles, submarines, whatever, when there's more than one person exposed, that's not a very helpful matrix. What we want is a matrix that differentiates between different types of accident. So, for example, I'll give you an example on a ship. Somebody could get electrocuted on a ship. That's one person dead. Most is the worst, probably the worst credible outcome. Maybe you've got toxic gas or smoke in a compartment. Well, that could kill everybody in the compartment. Or maybe you lose the entire vessel because of a fire or a collision or something, or a capsize, in which case you could kill most or all of the crew in the worst possible scenario. So ideally, we need those three different columns, the single death, the up to 10 deaths, or the more than 10 deaths, to say this covers the full range of possible accidents. So add columns to your matrix to make it more useful. So next, we've got some unconditional risk acceptance. So the MIL standard, nothing to do with the matrix really, but the MIL standard just says you can accept any level of risk, providing you've got somebody senior enough to do so, and you define that who is senior enough in your safety plan. So in theory, you can just cook up anything you like so somebody can accept any level of risk. Now, in reality, so in theory, you just look at where the residual risk is on the matrix and sign it off. Bang, done. Okay, that's bad, because in any jurisdiction that I'm aware of, that's not good practice. And it may be illegal. So there are almost always regulations imposing prescriptive requirements on us. So, for example, in the USA, for product safety, we may, if the product goes wrong and hurts somebody, we can be sued. Our only defense may be, under strict liability, our only defense may be due diligence. Okay, so we've got to show that we've done our homework, not just that we've estimated that the residual risk is somewhere and we've accepted it. Okay, we've got to do more than that. And I'll show you a link at the end. I did a blog post about this. Okay, and it explains that a bit. In the UK or Australia, we need to show that risk is a LARP or SFARP. Otherwise, we're not allowed to expose people to it. So it's as low as is reasonably practicable, or we've eliminated or minimized it so far as is reasonably practicable. And also in certain industries and jurisdictions, if you've got a big risk, you've got high severity, or you've got a significant chance of somebody being killed. In many industries, you've got to apply extra rigor to analyzing those risks. So the process by which you got to that residual risk level in the matrix is important. Okay, so just where it is on the matrix alone is not enough to justify exposing people to risks. So in all those cases, the matrix on its own and just the where the risk has been reduced to is not good enough. That's not good enough on its own. So you need to add these other risk acceptance conditions into your safety policy or plan. But it can be done, but the matrix alone is not enough. An interesting one is inappropriate units of time for probability. So we're talking about the likelihood or the probability of something happening in a given time frame. And very often we measure per year, let's say. But that may not be appropriate for certain systems, certain operating profiles. Maybe the thing is only operating for relatively short periods in a year. So it's not really reasonable to say per year. Maybe we need to use operating hours. Okay, and it's interesting that different standards are written around different concepts. So if we looked in the 61508 family of standards, you can, in most of them, not all, be careful, in most of them you can have high demand mode or low demand mode depending on how often your system might be called upon. Okay, if it's operating all the time, it will be high demand. If it's an occasional safety backup system, it might be low demand. Okay, now 61508 is specifically designed to cope with that, and so are the associated standards that derive from it. But as I say, be careful, because each individual functional safety standard does it slightly differently. Okay, even within the same domain. So if you're looking at the rail versions, the Senelec 5012, is it 50126, 7 and 9? I can't. Those numbers might be wrong. One of those standards does not allow you to claim low demand mode. The others do. So be careful. So you've got to pick an appropriate measure of time. for the operating profile of your system. So the solution, calibrate your matrix appropriately for your system and how it's used. And then uncalibrated risk probability levels. So for example, in the UK, there is an absolute upper limit of fatality risk that you're allowed to expose people to. The absolute maximum risk of death you're allowed to expose a worker to is 1 in 1,000 per person per annum. Remember, I talked about that straight line and what's the per person per annum risk level. That's important. For members of the public, it's a maximum of 1 in 10,000. Okay. Now, in reality, even in the riskiest occupations in the UK, they're nowhere near those limits. Okay. But whatever your jurisdiction, have you looked at the risk levels in your industry? What is typical? So if you're working in a certain industry, let's say offshore oil and gas, if you're exposing your workers, if you're saying, well, we'll accept a risk of up to whatever, which is 10 times, 100 times or 1,000 times greater than the rest of the industry, that's probably not okay. Okay. And if you had an accident, you might well get prosecuted just for permitting that level of risk and not for taking note of typical risk levels in the industry, because you should be aiming for that or better, really. That's good practice. Okay. So we do need to understand, we do need to calibrate our absolute levels of risk when we're thinking about what can we expose people to. Okay, we do need to calibrate the risk matrix. Okay, so in the last few slides, I think I've answered the question. So the red pill that gives us reality is where we look at the real world data and we use the real world data to inform the construction of our matrix. Okay, so the data precedes the framework. That's the reality pill. Whereas if we just grab a matrix and use it without considering the data that's relevant to it and the decisions that it represents, then what we've got is a categorization model. And in my long experience, a categorization model is worse than useless, because what happens is, what I mean by categorization is people say, what type of risk is this? Is it a WHS risk? Is it a risk to people? Is it a risk to equipment? Is it a technical risk? Is it an operating risk? What is it? Irrelevant. Risk is risk. Okay. Or people try to get hung up about where it is on the matrix when the matrix is arbitrary. And you just waste a lot of time arguing about arbitrary stuff that doesn't really relate to the real world. So avoid categorization for the sake of it. And with your matrix, make sure that it's not just putting stuff in boxes for the sake of it. Let reality inform your matrix. Okay. So we want to take the red pill, however frightening it is, to look at the real world and discover what's really going on out there. So very quickly, resources and next webinars. So first of all, and I'll be putting this in the chat in just a moment, there's a bunch of resources out there. Interestingly, those first three are the most popular resources on risk matrices online. They're not all entirely accurate, which does suggest there's a lot of misinformation out there on risk matrices. Then I've got a couple of blog posts from the safetyartisan.com, one on due diligence and safety, which I think you'll find helpful, and one on risk matrices. And then when I was talking about sense-making models versus categorization models, I got that. All credit is due to the Cynefin video on YouTube. I know it looks like Cynefin, but that's Welsh. It's pronounced Cynefin. Fantastic video by the founder of the people who talk about Cynefin, they didn't invent the term. Cynefin is a Welsh word for your place of being, where you're really coming from. Okay, really worthwhile watching that, so I do recommend it. And just to let you know, if you signed up for this on Eventbrite, I will email you the slides and other goodies. So do check your junk mail, please. Or if you're a subscriber, then do please check your junk mail. I will email the goodies to you as well. And then social media, I will post the links to the goodies on my various social media channels. So in the current series of tools and techniques webinars, that was risk matrices. We've had failure modes, effects analyses, and next is risk registers and hazard logs. Okay, and that is that's going to be in January. And as I say, do let me know what time zone you're in, because I'm thinking of changing the time of these webinars. So let me know what would work for you. And then we've got all these other ones coming up, all very popular search terms online, very popular analyses, lots of people asking questions. So that's it for my presentation. And we have just a little bit of time left to ask any further questions. So while you're thinking of your questions, I'm just going to go to the resources, and I'm going to post all of those resources and all that stuff in for you. So there you go. There it is in the chat. So you can click on those links, and I'll check afterwards that it has appeared in the social media as well. So have we got any more questions? Okay. Well, no questions, which is either very good or very bad. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. And as I say, they were all the webinars are in the Safety Engineering Academy. Okay. So thanks very much for your time. And I will see you in January to talk about risk registers and hazard logs and hazard tracking systems. So thanks very